so much for taking the time to chat with us today.
It's nice to talk with you.
Yes. So, both of you have one thing you have in common is just a long history of public service. You both served 3 terms each as governor of your respective states, Governor Evans in Washington State and Governor Dukakis in Massachusetts. So I just wanted to start the conversation to talk about how you both, or I guess one at a time, whoever wants to start, how you got into public service and into politics.
Dan, why don't you start with that?
Well, I've always been interested in politics. I came from a family that had politics in their background, and as youngsters, I remember making a big chart with my 2 brothers following the national convention, Republican convention. In those days, they couldn't tell who was going to win right from the beginning. They had to go through a number of ballots before they got to a winner. And I remember vividly the one in 1940 when Wendell Willkie was the Republican candidate, but he started out on the first ballot. I think he was running 6th out of about 6 prime candidates. And it took him half a dozen ballots to get up to the front. So a long and interesting history in following politics from the family's perspective.
Governor Dukakis?
Well, first let me say it's a pleasure to doing this with Dan, who was extremely helpful to me as a rookie governor back when I was first elected, and I've never forgotten. Why did I have interest in politics? Well, I'm not sure I know, except that my parents were both immigrants. My father came over here when he was 15 from a predominantly Greek town in western Turkey. My mother came from central Greece. She was 9. And both of them were pretty remarkable when they did. My dad had arrived here at the age of 15. He had an Nicholas pilot, couldn't speak the language, and 12 years later he graduated from Harvard. How he did it, I have no idea. This is back, he arrived in 1912 and graduated medical school in 24, and practiced medicine for over 50 years. My mother was part of a Greek family that, like a lot of Greek families, was interested in politics. They settled in the city of Haverhill, which was a shoe town in those days, up in the Merrimack Valley in Massachusetts. And my mother, to the best, as best we could determine, she was the first Greek girl, by the Mr. who went away to college unescorted. It had never happened before. A single Greek girl leaving home and going to the base college in Lewiston, Maine. And although neither one of us was a political activist in a serious sense, the World News Roundup on CBS was always on at 6 o'clock at night. From my earliest age. So it was a family atmosphere that was interesting in world affairs, what was going on. And you also understand, I'm speaking now from the Massachusetts standpoint, what was going on politically. I grew up in the town immediately west of Boston. It was 3 miles from downtown Boston. With 3 exceptions, there were no people of color who were permitted or could live in the town of Boston. And at an early age 9 or 10, this bothered the hell out of me. Don't ask me why, but it did. And it had a lot to do with my getting into politics in the first place. Was active in student politics and that kind of stuff. And then, as I went on to college, began to get active in politics, to use that term. But the degree of racial and religious bias and prejudice and discrimination in those days, certainly in Massachusetts, and I expect all over the country, was so obvious, and don't ask me why, it was something to budge, and had a lot to do with my getting in about this in the first place.
Thank you, Governor Dukakis. I actually want to jump off that because Governor Evans, you also expressed a passion for civil rights and racial equality. I read an excerpt from your autobiography recently, and you talked about running for office during the civil rights movement, and on your slate was a Black candidate, which was obviously very rare at the time. So, Governor Evans, I want you to pick up from Governor Dukakis and talk about why advancing civil rights was so important to you.
Well, it's interesting that I served in the legislature for 8 years and then became governor. I became governor right at the midst of a very activist time in our nation's history. It was a time when the young and young men particularly, had an increasing opposition to the war which was going on in Vietnam. But it was also a time of an increasing interest in the environment and increasing interest, especially in civil rights. So all three of those major issues were in front of not only elected officials at that time, but in front of the people. And the people were taking very strong stands on all of those issues, and it made for a very interesting and sometimes troublesome time when I served as governor.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to jump off that and talk about, pushing big policies. When I read about both of you, both Governor Evans, Governor Dukakis, you both pushed for major changes in your respective states. Governor Evans, I know you pushed for legislation that eventually created the community college system. Governor Dukakis, I know you had deep passion for reforming healthcare. These are huge ideas which are often polarizing. Often there's lots of factions, disagreements. How did, and either you can jump in, how did you build those coalitions to get those big policies, and get some kind of common ground to pass policies that benefited, all the residents of each of your states?
Well, it seems when you talk about it that creating a new community college system would be an easy task and a very popular one. The idea of a community college system was pretty popular, but there were huge legislative fights between the state public school system and some legislative leaders and others about who should run the community college system. The superintendent of public instruction wanted to keep it all under his control, and I was interested in creating a new system that would be devoted to community colleges as a new part of our higher education system. It was sort of a large legislative fight, not an easy one, and ultimately we prevailed and created a new community college system separated from the public school system and separated from the higher education system as well. It was its own and very large part of our educational system.
Governor Dukakis, I wanted to ask you about healthcare. I know you became known for your passion for reforming healthcare, and I actually read a couple speeches you did regarding how you weathered, deep disagreement, and yeah, to this day we still have disagreement about how to reform healthcare and what the approach to healthcare, but yeah, there's challenges, especially during this pandemic. So, Governor Dukakis, can you talk about how you built that coalition to push for those big picture ideas?
You have to understand one aspect of my evolution as a public servant and so forth. I went to a small college just outside of Philadelphia called Swarthmore. I'd never heard of this. When my brother first suggested I take a look at it, they said, "Isn't that a girls' school?" He said, "No, that's Skidmore." That's how much I knew about Swarthmore College. But Swarthmore College was one of the very good small colleges, and there was an active political presence there. But you have to understand, I started as a tentative feedback at Swarthmore. And I was a pretty good student, except for one thing. I took general physics toward my first year, and I just couldn't get it. I mean, I'd never had this experience. It's been a terrible deed. And that kind of was the end of my pre-medical career. And I began getting much more deeply involved in public policy and politics itself. But that was a pretty important experience to me. I mean, I'd never had a real failure in Canada academically before I had in my first year at Swarthmore. And at the same time, as I explained a few minutes ago, politics, when we talk about polarization these days, I mean, there was a lot of polarization back then. Serious racial and religious discrimination. And as I said before, that had a real effect on me, and a real impact on me from the beginning. When I was literally 9 or 10, I was actually getting involved. Then in the 50s, we had a lot of controversy over those kinds of issues. And I was very much involved in that. The other thing that had a real impact on me was this whole question of, okay, you're in public office, you're there to try to do things. How do you deal with what was a very polarizing environment about this? With racial and religious prejudice and lots of divisions these days, at least we're attempting to deal with. And that has an impact. So one of the challenges, I think, for me and Dan, I expect for you, is how do you try to bring people together and create consensus around a difficult issue? And I was elected first in 1975, 74 as governor. At a time when my state was in terrible shape economically. And I and my administration worked our heads off to turn that around. We went from a unemployment rate of something like 12 or 13% down to 5 in my 4 years. And I was 40 points ahead in the primaries. With 5 weeks to go, and lost that primary to a very conservative Democrat. And I have to tell you, I was kind of disappointed because I was finished politically. Fortunately for me, that defeat had his own problem. Ethically and otherwise. And I decided to run again. This time, having learned some lessons about how you try to bring people together constructively and build consensus. And I don't mean close common denominator consensus, I mean consensus that produce real results. And I spent a lot of time having to listen to people tell me how I screwed up the first time. And when I was elected again, one of the things that I decided to do, and learn from my experience, was to try to bring people together in a serious and structured way. And so I began creating working groups. Healthcare was a big issue, so we created a working group made up of whom? Our people across the political spectrum. These weren't just friends and supporters. And the same was true when it came to environmental issues, economic development, all the issues that people like you and I had to deal with as governors. And lo and behold, I discovered that if you brought people together, and one of the nice things about being governor is that when you ask people to participate, I don't remember anybody saying, screw you, governor, I'm not interested. No matter where they were coming from, philosophically. The governor asked them, and they responded positively. And it turns out that if we will accept, if we brought people together, have good discussions, look for common ground, 9 times out of 10, we were able to get things done. That was kind of discovery. In a highly polarized environment. And so I became the creator of working groups. If we got an issue, we put a working group together. Not for long, for 3-4 months, then we wanted to resolve. But it was amazing how it worked. And worked very, very effectively. Should I instinctively note about this early on? Well, I don't know that instinctively you do it. But I must say that in my second and third term, we had really great success. And it got so that the Republican minority in the legislature was a good job. Started complaining that we were getting everything through. We didn't really have much to oppose. And it was because these work groups actually got things done with very broad consensus. Now today, I don't know what to say about it. Only because it may be more difficult, but I'm not sure. And you were able to do a lot of things and do well. And you used, I think, a consensus building kind of process. But in my second and third term, we did a lot of things, did them successfully, and did so on the whole with very broad support. Largely because we involved people actively from the beginning, in a way that genuinely invited them into the process and listened to it. And we really does work. Would it work today? Well, that's you know, what are we doing this? But Massachusetts is not an easy state. It's a great state in many ways, but it's not easy when it comes to policy judgment, decision. And we had great success once I kind of got this working group thing going on a regular basis. And we were very successful.
Thank you, Governor Dukakis. I want to jump off that point about today, because I think there's a perception that building consensus means giving up conviction, that compromise means that you lose because the other because you're not fully living up your political convictions. So Governor Evans, I want you to answer this, and then you can jump in, Governor Dukakis, is how do you build those coalitions and have compromise while maintaining your political convictions? Because both of you had really strong convictions politically. I definitely can read that in the various things you wrote. And I think there's a perception that if you compromise, or you have to give up your conviction, or you have to give up some of your convictions. So how do you maintain that conviction and belief, but also be willing to build those coalitions and to compromise to move forward? I'll start with you, Governor Evans.
Well, there's at the state level particularly, and I think probably to a degree at the national level, many of the issues really are not heavily partisan to begin with. I said in one of my inaugural addresses that I've never seen a Democratic highway or a Republican school. And so that many of the things we were dealing with essentially were not heavily partisan to begin with. I found that when I got to the U.S. Senate, it was a time, and being in a legislative body, the tendency is to have a lot more of the opposition to each other than you saw at the state level. But I've always said that politics is a contact sport. It's not intended to be easy, and it will not always be either bipartisan or nonpartisan, because the two parties in general have different views on how to govern, and you carry those forward, and they lead to conflict a lot of the time. I think the real problem is not that we're so divided, we are, but that the division has turned into considering your political opposition as enemies, not just those with different opinions. And I think that the difference between the time that I was active and today is that then we could have huge policy differences, and there were plenty of strongly different ideas presented on the floor of Congress or when I was governor. But once you walked off the floor and somebody banged the gavel down for a recess, then you could have friendships across the aisle and respect across the aisle. And I'm afraid that what I see today from looking from a distance actually is that too often people looking across the aisle look at the opposition as enemies rather than as people who have different ideas. I think in the time that Mike Dukakis and I were in office, we had plenty of differences of opinion between the parties, and sometimes they were very sharp and very vocal, but we could set those aside when we quit being officials, and we could have friendships across the aisle. And on many occasions, I found myself, especially when I was in the Senate, arguing vociferously, party against party, on one set of issues, and then finding myself joining a member from the other side as co-sponsors of legislation that wasn't really partisan, but it may have differences between various parts of the country or for other reasons, and that was done frequently. I don't see that happens very often anymore.
Governor Dukakis, what are your thoughts?
Well, take one of my favorites. When Dan and I were governors and legislators before that, we had millions of Americans without health insurance, without any guarantee that if they were sick, that something would care for them. That bothered the hell out of me, and I suspect it bothered the hell out of me. So if you begin with a sense that, hey, this is a real problem, and either we work on real solutions, or we're going to have millions of Americans who won't be getting adequate health care, or will be going to get it for free in a variety of confusing ways. And the question is, so what do we do about that? Not only that, but of course, the burden of free healthcare was killing the healthcare system at the same time. Again, I can't speak for Dan on this, but I found that whether one was a liberal or conservative, the question of what to do about all of this free care that was loading up the system wasn't doing a really effective job of making people healthy, but was costing a hell of a lot of money. But there was very broad consensus about the fact that we had to do something about it. And once you get people to agree that it's a problem, you're on the way to a solution. And I found that the ideas that I had turned out to be nowhere near as good as others that were being proposed, and in some cases were at least allegedly more conservative than I was philosophical. But this was a real problem. And the question was what to do about it in a way that not only provided good health care for people, but did so at an affordable cost. And I don't see how you can look at this issue, at this situation, no matter where you're coming from, philosophically, and not conclude that it's a big problem and it's got to be dealt with. Now, when Congress finally did something about this, it's survived by a handful or two of voters, but I think there was a very broad consensus that we had to do something about it and it had to be comprehensive. And these days, I don't know, but I think it's very unlikely that we will repeal this basic framework we put together on a bipartisan basis, by the way. At least initially, there were differences, obviously, but a little difficult to argue that it was a good thing that millions of Americans didn't have decent affordable health care. And that was true with lots of issues. Once we brought people together, looked at the problems seriously, and concluded, yeah, it's a real problem, and how we go about the business of making something happen that's good and good policy and good for people. Now, we're in the middle of an interesting period of American political history, and who knows what's going to happen in the next 2 or 3 or 4 or 8 years, but I found creating these working groups, bringing people into them, including people who started by that process by thinking that they would never agree with the other folks. And it was amazing how, with rare exceptions, we were able to come up with good solutions that solve problems. And it had everything to do with sitting down, getting to know people, sharing ideas, including that we had a real problem, and then going to work and making things happen.
I have one more question. We're towards the end of this discussion. Thank you both for taking your time to talk to us today. Governor Dukakis, I wanted to talk about, I'm a journalist, I'm in the media, and I had read several speeches where you say that one of the things you have to do as a politician is learn how to deal with the media. And I know that you've had an up and down relationship with media, and I think every politician does, and I'm interested in hearing, I think, there's distrust, there's been growing distrust between media and politicians, as we have seen these last few years. What role, or I think a lot of times we see media as being toxic, or politicians painted that way. They're toxic, they're responsible for, fake news, all that. But why is it so important to have that relationship with media? And how can the media actually facilitate those coalitions and, civil debate?
Well, I first want to say that I never had a real problem with the media. I thought they were important. I treated them with respect. I don't remember getting into battles with the media. But I also recognize that they were a very important part of the system. But I don't recall having an antagonistic relationship with either. I knew many of them. I respected them. And for the most part, we had a good, constructive relationship. And as a result, I don't remember getting into battle with the media, the kind of thing that we've seen, particularly with this fake news stuff and that kind of thing. But you've got to be open, you've got to be respectful, I think, of the role that the media plays. And you've got to treat them with genuine respect and with the kind of respect that they deserve because they're an important part of the system. But I enjoy that relationship and don't remember ever having battles with the media. But you got to treat them right, you got to be honest with them. And I'd like to think over my 12 years that I did that. But the method getting and battles we've seen now under the Trump presidency and others, that just wasn't part of what I thought we should do, and it certainly didn't, and it doesn't lead, for the most part, to good results. Now, they also needed, I've got some reporters in my family group, I've got a daughter who's a reporter producer for Colorado Public Radio, I've got, a number of members of the family that are involved with me in one way or the other. And always have had, I think, a respectful relationship, and a good one. And I don't think that's particularly difficult to do it right.
Governor Evans, do you have thoughts on this question?
Well, when I came into office as governor, one of the first questions I asked my press secretary was, how often should we have press conferences? And we debated that for a while, and then I said, well, how about 2 a week? And he said, 1 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon. He said, that'll never work because half the papers are morning papers and half of them are afternoon papers. And so if it's an afternoon news conference, half of them will be off of their time and won't be able to use the news in a good way. So we ended up with, during the legislative sessions, we had 3 a week on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and they were alternate afternoon and morning news conferences. At the end of 12 years, I had 1,200 press conferences, about 100 a year, and that proved to be hugely successful because you had a chance to explain things. It was a time when there was a transition between newspapers being the prime and almost the only source of news and television beginning to be more and more important. And that transition was very interesting most of the people who showed up at the news conferences were newspaper reporters. And then as the television people started to show up, the newspaper people wouldn't let them sit at the long table where the press sat. They said, "You gotta stand by the cameras, you're just cameramen. And your job is to take down all the marvelous questions and answers that the newspaper people are coming up with." That didn't last for very long before the television people got a lot more aggressive. But I had really, I think one of the smartest things we did early on was to have frequent press conferences that both we and the press could depend upon. And having 1,200 of them in a 12-year period was hugely beneficial, because I had a chance to speak out and the press had a chance to ask questions. There was never this feeling that either side's trying to hide anything or to do anything that was really out of the ordinary. And as a result, our press relationships were, I think, really quite good. There were times when they zoomed in on a particular issue that I may not have wanted to talk about very much, but that was part of the business. And there were times when I had big news I wanted to get across, and I just hoped at those times that they were interested also and would ask questions based on what I wanted to talk about. And that usually worked, but occasionally they had different ideas of what they wanted to talk about. And the press is really king in those areas. They're the ones who are asking the questions, and you've got to respond. But it was, I looked forward to press conferences. There were times when I could get my ideas across to a bigger population through the press, and I enjoyed the back and forth. It wasn't always easy. Sometimes they had tough questions, and sometimes it was a little combative, but not usually. It was a good. There were good sessions, and it's a very important relationship to get your story across.
I'm going to wrap things up. I wanted to give both of you, Governor Dukakis, Governor Evans, a chance. Where the theme here is we want to talk. You both have addressed how polarizing the political environment is now, and how challenging it is. But I do want to give both of you a chance to give some final comments in terms of, based on your experiences, based on what you see, what do you think is key to breaking through in this polarizing political environment?
Just say, I think what Dan just said makes all kinds of sense. You've got to be open, you've got to be honest, you've got to share information which is important and which the media have right to know about and to question you about. I have one additional, wasn't a problem, but it's a little unusual, I guess. I'm a huge public transportation advocate, and I used to take public transportation from my home to the state house and back again. And I also had this thing about having dinner with my family, which meant I got on a transit car and went from the state house in Boston to my home in Vermont. So I was always kind of out there. And the press knew it, but they respected it. If they wanted to walk along with me or take the streetcar home with me, I was very willing to do that. And you don't have a government against you. So I was going from the state house to our home. And at first there was little bit of a, what game is gonna be out there. Yeah, the answer was, yeah. I mean, after a while, didn't seem to be unusual. And had a good time being out there and enjoying our interaction. I kind of drew the line when it came to the house, because we were in our home. And by and large, as well, it is one situation where it was a Saturday and I had a lot of work to do at the State House, so I was in early. And I called Katie and said, let's get some lunch and have a lunch dinner. I had a long day. And when I arrived at our house, two women had already set up housekeeping in the driveway and were waiting for me. And they had, stuff out there and so on and so forth. I said, hey, what's this? And they said, well, my friend here is evicted from her apartment. I don't know exactly what happened. There was a boyfriend involved as well. And I said, but it's Saturday afternoon. Come down to the State House on Monday and we'll sit down with you and go over and do what we can do. Yeah, but we really want to talk to you now. And I remember saying, well, it's Saturday night. Kitty and I have planned a special little dinner. And we're going to have lunch. So thanks, but not tonight. Anyway, she stuck around for a while. Her boyfriend had thrown her out of the bus. And on Monday, I went to work and I said, what? You just really help this young woman. Well, it turned out she and her boyfriend reconciled. So all of her work, find some decent housing for her, went by the board. But that was quite unusual, actually. People got used to this, and I had a good time. I mean, I learned a lot riding teeth. And I think that was not only helpful politically, but it made me a better go, because I can't interact.
Let you wrap things up, Governor Evans. What are your thoughts?
Well, I had a little bit of an advantage over Governor Dukakis because the capital in Washington is in Olympia, which is a smaller community and it's 60 miles away from Seattle. So we were several steps removed from the large population where Mike was right in the middle of it. It was long enough ago that the exchange, even when there were real differences of opinion, the exchanges really came through the media, the organized media, and today we have another entry into that game, which is the people who have their own blogs. We've given everybody a megaphone, and now it's not just the organized press, it's individuals who have something to say, and if they're organized enough to create the megaphone, the way of communicating, they can have huge audiences. And I think that we've got to get better accustomed to that method of communication because it's not as organized, it's not as professional, and I think that it means that the chances for misunderstanding, the chances for additional conflict are higher than they used to be because during my active time politically, it was the press, I think at its best in the post-war era, where there were still some organized outfits in the press that were politically one-sided, but generally the press recognized that there were two things to do. One was to create and to present the news, the other was to present opinion. And those were very separate. Especially in newspapers, the reporters were trained and constantly reminded that their job was to gather facts, present things factually, stay away from any opinion at all, and then on the editorial pages they could say what they want, and they often did, and occasionally those of us in political office had to wince when we read what came out on the political pages, but at least it was done professionally. It was done by the editorialists of the newspapers, and now it can be anybody with any kind of a gripe, but with access to a microphone, who can spread their own view of the news. And I think that that's one of the new problems we have today is the news coming from all sorts of sources, many of which are not professional, many of which don't even respond to the old adages of news being non-sided, but strictly professional and separated from the opinions. But and in addition to all of that, today we have what a lot of people now are calling fake news, but it's truly just opinion of people who pass it off as news, and they're not professional at it. I think that I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what it'll be like 10 years from now, but someplace along the line, either the presentation of news has got to become more professional in its entirety, or the people have got to get much more able to distinguish between the fake news, the real news, and opinion. And right now, I think that's a big problem.
Yeah. So just to wrap things up, I hear two really interesting points here. Governor Dukakis is talking about going on with public transit and having those conversations. I think it's those happenstance. I think in the pandemic we're really missing those kind of chance encounters, right, with people when you're at the bar, you're at the library, and I think Governor Evans, you make a point in terms of about media. It's so scattered now.